Gary Davis has had a long-time career as a civil servant, but to me he is a man immersed in art and a service of another kind. I find his journey both fascinating and inspiring, and I'm sure you will too. So first, Gary, since we're recording this in January, I would love for you to read your poem, Winter Morning.
Okay. This was written probably 15 years ago or more. Winter morning. I stood at a window, watching gray clouds silently drift across an eastern sky, tinged with glowing orange and scarlet. Tangled branches devoid of leaves danced in a frigid wind. Points of fire gleamed between a filigree silhouette of distant woods as a burnished sun crawled higher. I listened intently to the sleeping house and heard only rusty shutters creaking. Interspersed with heavy breathing of slumbering guests, wind chimes announced a cold dawn as scattered flakes of snow gathered on morning's frigid edge in frosty conversation.
Thank you so much. So I know you as a choir member and a lector, and then I learned that you also wrote these poems. Now, how many poems have you written?
I counted these up the other day, and I've written at least 640 poems.
Starting when you were a teenager or early young adult?
Yes, I think I probably started these poems back in the early 50s.
Okay. And so your email address mentions that you are Franciscan, but
yes.
You've had a long, winding, and colorful road to get there. So since we're going back in time a little bit, can you tell me anything about your childhood?
Sure. I was an only child. My mother had been married before, and she had had 2 miscarriages. The last one because her husband was killed in a terrible explosion at a gunpowder factory. And the doctor told her no more pregnancies. But when she married my dad in 1935, they really wanted children, and so along came me. So I was an only child, but I think I really always wanted siblings, but of course they really didn't want to take any more chances, so they never did have any other children. Mm-hmm. Now, it's interesting because my mother was one of 10 children. My father was one of 4. Mm-hmm. So I had lots of cousins and aunts and uncles and folks like that around. Mm-hmm. And I was raised in the Presbyterian church in a small village called Carney's Point, New Jersey, which was built by the DuPont Company for its gunpowder workers back at the turn of the century. And we were fairly faithful. I sang in the youth choir and the junior choir and the senior choir and was in youth group and all of those sorts of things. My parents were pretty active in the church as well. And I went to high school, and I had always been very interested in art. I always loved to draw when I was small. I did a lot of drawing, and my favorite class, of course, was art in high school, as well as English and history. Mm-hmm. And I was writing, probably beginning in the 8th grade, different things that I loved to write. I loved words and the sound of words and the meanings of words. And I also very much loved to draw.
Mm-hmm. And so then in your late teens and your 20s, things became somewhat more interesting, shall we say. And do you know, before you, well, maybe I should let you tell the story first and then ask that question. So anyway, care to elaborate about your late teens and your 20s?
Yeah, I was, in high school, I was very shy. Mm-hmm. I had severe acne, and was self-conscious. I had friends. I had some good guy friends, but I was just terrified of girls.
Okay.
I don't know why. But
well,
anyway.
I know why. A lot of people feel that way.
And my best friend, Willard Roberts, had a girlfriend, and I think I was a little jealous of him that he had a girlfriend. But anyway, I had a lot of friends in high school, and we palled around and did things together. Then my art teacher really convinced me that I should try to look for a career in art. And so he wanted me to go to Pratt Institute in New York City, which was at that time considered the best art school in the country. But the Big Apple terrified me. And I didn't think I would do well there. So instead, I was accepted at the Philadelphia Museum College of Art in Philadelphia, where I began my studies in art. It's interesting because I guess it's a typical story. Even though I had been going to church and all of that, when I got out of the house and in with other people, and this was the age of, the Bohemian age and beatniks and so forth and artsy folks, and I started going to parties and drinking and
I think kids in the sort of college seem to still do that sort of thing, actually. But I know you're talking about the 50s, like the late 50s, mid to late 50s.
Yes, I entered art college in September, August of 1954, and had many different experiences there. I can't even remember some of the people. It's been so long ago, but there were a couple of friends of mine, but that I did make friends with. Probably the one I remember the most was, I don't remember his last name, but his first name was John, and it just amazed me that he had been one of the Japanese Americans interred during the Second World War in camps.
Wow.
And I had never heard of that, and of course it was never in any history books.
Yeah.
So that was quite a revelation.
Yeah. And so around like a few years after that, 4 years after high school graduation, you said that you started journaling. That would be 1958. And that was around the time that you were asked to leave Maryville College. Do you think that the journaling had something to do with that? Was that a way of coping with whatever it was you were going through at that time, or was it related?
I think that probably it was related to it in some ways. I mean, you put it very politely. I was kicked out.
Yeah, well, asked to leave is kind of the same thing. I mean, I suppose told to leave is different. Yes, goodbye. We don't want you.
Right. Not only that, they demanded that I get out of town.
Oh. Now, can you tell us, do you want to say what it was that you did that caused this reaction?
Well, I'll give you a little background. Maryville College was a very strict Calvinist Presbyterian small college about 12 miles east of Knoxville, Tennessee, in what we might call Dolly Parton country.
Yeah.
Real close to the Great Smoky Mountains National Forest. Well, they had very strict rules. Of course, no alcohol on campus. Of course, there were no co-ed dorms in those days. And they watched closely, like eagle eyes, any kind of dating or things like that. I mean, when you went to meet a young lady at the girls' dorm, they had 1,000 lights blazing and an old dragon lady with eagle eyes watching every single move.
Yeah, yeah.
That gives you an idea of what it was like.
Yeah.
Now, what they didn't realize, or I don't think they realized, was when you have those kind of restrictions, it seems to me that there was a lot more drinking and carousing and sex going on because of those strict rules.
Yeah.
So what happened actually, I continued after my first semester, and I got some friends and so forth. I think I continued my wayward ways from art college with partying and so forth. And the late summer of 1958, which would be my senior year, I was looking forward to graduating, in 1959. I was summoned to the dean's office, which is never a good thing. And someone had gone into my room and reported that they found booze and some panties.
Yeah.
And
boy.
They brought that up to me and said I had a terrible reputation there and of partying and carousing, and my grades were falling, and I didn't go to chapel like I should, because they had chapel monitors. We called them chapel police.
Yeah.
And so he said, "What's your answer to this?" So, being only 20 years old and realizing that discretion is not realizing, I should say, that discretion is the better part of valor, I told him what I thought about their rules. Was not terribly smart.
Well, not smart if you wanted to stay there, no.
Yeah, right. And although I think he had already made up his mind. And
That's
so he told me I was expelled. And two of my best friends who were partying with me, they were kicked out too. And all three of us were told to get out of town, or they would have the local constabulary round us up.
Wow.
And escort us out of town. Well, that was quite a shock.
Well, I'm saying, I don't even know if is that even legal for someone to be expelled from a whole town? Because drinking was not illegal, and neither was carousing. But, I think it's that kind of place.
Might not be in today's world, but remember, this was in Tennessee back in the 50s, and the local constabulary, did whatever the administration particularly wanted.
Yeah.
And nobody raised an eyebrow about that.
Yeah.
So it was not the very best of phone calls I ever made to my parents.
I'm sure.
Informing of this, since they were 800 miles away.
Yeah.
And so we got we all loaded our stuff into one of the guys' cars and went to a neighboring town and found a room. And then my parents decided to drive all the way. This is without interstates.
Oh, boy.
From New Jersey to the college. And they were going to talk to the dean and see if they couldn't get me a break so that I could continue and graduate. And they found out that he was adamant. He wouldn't change his mind.
Yeah.
So then what to do?
And then you started working after that. But before we do that, because I think this poem kind of sums up in some ways some of your college experiences, would you mind reading Scotch, Miles Davis and Me?
Okay. This is Scotch, Miles Davis and Me. In my hand, Dewars. On my turntable, Charlie Parker's sax, blending mellow notes into soft, muted light. Twilight's caressing rose. A sweet trumpet. Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie tickling the ivories on Now's the Time, first track on the essential Miles Davis. Languid afternoon, in which memories dance like faded shadows on my wall, beckoning me to join their listless illusions. Instead, I sip and listen, welcoming those haunting notes remembering early days, youth with piss and vinegar, smoke-filled clubs, and love. Alas, shadows fade into night's chill mist. My glass empty, a silent trumpet, an empty stage, a closed door.
And that poem, I mean, is there anybody who you could say has influenced you as a poet in particular?
Over time, I guess my favorite poet was John Keats, and you'll recall his famous poem Endymion, where he wrote, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever."
Right.
I read his letters too, which were amazing.
Mm-hmm.
A whole book of just his letters. But his poetry always influenced me, and there were many other poets that I really liked at that time also.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been influenced by poetry and by novels. And growing up, I just loved to read. My mother was a voracious reader, and I think I got that from her.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any novels that you would mention as your favorites?
I think when I was at Maryville, one of the classes I enjoyed the most was 18th century literature. And my favorite novelist was one of the first novelists, was Henry Fielding, who wrote Tom Jones and Moll Flanders and some others. And Tom Jones was just a hilarious hoot, which they eventually made a movie with. But I thought something I never thought they could make
Albert
a movie
Finney?
of.
Was it Albert Finney?
Yeah, Albert Finney.
I've not seen the movie,
great.
but I'm aware of some of it. So I guess at the time he would have been someone who appealed to you, from what I know of the storyline, which is just a little bit. But yeah. Well, so you have these off-color adventures, or slightly off-color, or whatever you want to call them. But all along, you were always drawn to God and also to the church. And how was it that you realized that you wanted to deepen yourself spiritually?
Well, I had always been attracted there, and then it kind of came and went. When I was at Maryville, I had a friend of mine, Joe Williams, who was an Episcopalian, who had served during the Korean War in the Navy on an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. The chaplain of the aircraft carrier was an Episcopal priest. And so he became an Episcopalian because of him. Well, he was one of my best friends in Maryville. And he invited me one time to go to a very small Episcopal church in downtown Maryville called St. Andrew's. It's still there. Mm-hmm. And it was just wonderful. The priest was an elderly English bachelor with all these marvelous mannerisms and eccentricities. And I was really taken with the beautiful liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer and attracted by the Eucharist. And that was the beginning of my introduction and my almost lifelong service in the Episcopal Church. And it became more and more developed. After I was expelled from Maryville, I came home and taught as a substitute teacher in Pennsgrove, New Jersey, which was next to Carney's Point that I mentioned before. And there was an Episcopal church there, the Church of Our Merciful Savior. The priest was a big, tall, 6'5" priest with a very nice family. Mm-hmm. And he kind of took me under his wing. And because of him, I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, in that church, in December in 1960, I believe it was. But he was also making his way through the Society of St. Francis, which then was called the American Congregation of Franciscans.
Mm-hmm.
But it was part of an Anglican Episcopal movement of lay people and clergy who wanted to follow the Franciscan way of simplicity and service without taking the vows of being, a friar who was in a friary because he was married and so forth. But that was the beginning of my Franciscan journey there in that church. We used to meet early in the morning before I would go to work and say the daily office together, that is morning prayer. And then he introduced me by way of retreats at a friary on Long Island to more of the Franciscan way of life. And I've stayed with that.
Because now you are a Franciscan tertiary. Can you explain that a little bit?
800 years ago, St. Francis had two interesting friends, a man and woman, who came to him. They were husband and wife. They had children, and they were fairly well-to-do. They didn't want to really enter a friary, but they wanted to keep a Franciscan way of life. And so he created what is called the Third Order of St. Francis. And these are lay people, or some are clergy too, who don't want to actually go into a friary, but they want to keep the Franciscan way. And it just happens to be the largest religious order in the world today, the Franciscan order, the Third Order. There are three orders. The first order are the friars, the brothers, who live in a friary. The second order are the Poor Clares of Reparation, who are cloistered nuns. And the third order, of course, is people that are following the way of St. Francis without going into a convent or a friary.
Mm-hmm. And for those who are, we've heard of St. Francis preaching to the birds, or I think most people are still aware of the stories about St. Francis. But can you give a couple of the principles? There's simplicity. Is that kind of what it boils down to, living a life of simplicity, or is there more that you can tell us about that?
Well, his story is remarkable because you have always heard it of people going from rags to riches as an expression. Mm-hmm. Well, he went from riches to rags.
Yeah.
His father was immensely wealthy merchant in the city of Assisi in Italy. Traveled a lot to France particularly. That's how he insisted that his son would be called Francis after French. And Francis himself, growing up, was a playboy. He had lots of friends, and they had lots of encounters, and he always wanted to be a knight. And, he would give liberally money to all of his friends with these big parties and all this kind of stuff. And then Assisi got into a war with a neighboring city called Perugia. And, of course, he joined with the soldiers from Assisi because he wanted to be a knight. But the battle went very badly. And he was captured and imprisoned. And he got very ill while he was in prison until his father ransomed him. And when he came home, he was a changed person. He wasn't a playboy anymore. He didn't know what he wanted. He went out and lived in caves nearby and had a lot of, spiritual experiences there. And the upshot was that he found that what he wanted to do was to give up all his riches, and he gave away all his patrimony to the poor. And he went and helped to try to build some decrepit churches that were falling down, and he wanted to live this simple life of prayer and helping the poor, and other people just were attracted to him. He was very persuasive, and he was very joyful.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved to sing, because at the time the French troubadours with their chansons were coming through the countryside, and he loved to sing these French songs all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people began to join him, and it just took off. And many people were attracted, because at the time there was just so much corruption and so much wealth and so many poor that they rejected all of that kind of a life.
Well, that sounds familiar, actually.
Yeah.
I guess they say, there's nothing new under the sun, or there are various other ways of saying that. But you were attracted to that lifestyle, and, there are people who would maybe admire St. Francis without taking the orders. I mean, was that something that, sometimes people feel that God is pursuing them in some way and keeps telling them, you got to do this, or was it something that you just, as soon as you learned about it, you just said, okay, I'm going to do this when I'm able?
Well, it was a very long process of growing into it.
Mm-hmm.
And there were times when I departed from it. I started it and stopped a couple of times. Of course, in the meantime, I was getting married and having 8 kids and all this. And so sometimes I got away from it. Mm-hmm. But I always felt I was called back. Mm-hmm. And it's like that poem, I think it was called The Hound of Heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And that Jesus pursued me.
Mm-hmm.
And finally I gave in.
Yeah.
And said yes.
I mean, I guess you could keep writing all your life, but that's he can find you where you go.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah. There's no way to hide.
Yeah, exactly. So you already mentioned that you are married, and you guys have been married for 51 years.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of children, by current standards, 8 children. And your love story actually is sort of an interesting one, or at least it was to me. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was teaching at a very poor, rural, small school in South Jersey, Quinton Elementary School. And I taught 5th and 6th grade. And one of the 6th graders was a boy named Brian Runkle. And we got to kind of be friends, and we were both interested in sports. And this poor school didn't even have any sports facilities or anything. Didn't have a library, didn't have a cafeteria. And we decided to build some sports things, like a backstop for baseball and softball. And he helped me with all of that. Well, because of that, he invited me to come home with him to meet his mom and dad and his sisters and his other brother, and I did. Well, he had 2 sisters. Mm-hmm. One was Diana. She was the oldest, and she had this beautiful red hair. It was very fair and tall, very intelligent, very spiritual. And he also had another sister who was 2 years younger, Suzanne, who was blonde and fair and also very intelligent and spiritual. Well, I was first very attracted to Diana. She had graduated from Bob Jones University in South Carolina and got a fellowship to Clemson University. She wanted to eventually be a doctor, but she was getting her master's degree in electron microscopy, I think it was called. And Suzanne would have nothing to do with me when we first met. She completely ignored me. She was going to nursing school in Delaware to be a registered nurse. So then one Christmas, before Christmas, Diana came home with a friend, and we got to talking. We found out we had a lot of like interests, and we both seemed to be very attracted to each other. And we started dating. Well, that made Suzanne mad. She always envied her sister.
Oh, yeah.
And it was one of those things going on. I mean, I didn't do that to make her mad or anything.
No. Yeah, that was their issue.
Yeah.
Yep.
So anyway, then I guess it was the next Christmas or so, she came home, and I asked her to go on a date with me to Philadelphia, to an opera and to the beautiful Philadelphia Museum College of Art, and out to dinner. And we got along so very well. It was, so much attracted to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And then she told me that she had a tentative engagement to a young man in South Carolina, which I didn't know before.
Yeah.
So
minor detail, huh?
Yeah, so here was a dilemma.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, I had to go down to Virginia to spend some time with my parents, who had retired and bought a farm down in the Shenandoah Valley. Well, I knew that this young man was going to come up and ask her to marry him during Christmas. So I was in a real, my parents couldn't figure out what was wrong with me.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't know what was going to happen. You know, was this going to be the end of it all, and just what? After that, I came back to, after I visited with my parents, I came back, and Diana was quite cool to me. And I found out that while I was gone, his name was Lawton King. He had proposed and gave her an heirloom ring that was his grandmother's, and her father gave permission. So I was really depressed after all of that.
Yeah.
And later, I came, when I was back teaching again, I met Suzanne, and we started to date, of all things. Mm-hmm. So I guess we were both ready, because that following, I guess it was March, this other had happened over Christmas. The following March, we got engaged.
Yeah.
And we both ended up having a double wedding.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, a double wedding in the church across the street from her house.
Wow. Well,
so
obviously, I mean,
kind of remarkable.
Yeah, I was going to say that all the dynamics that were going on, but it worked out, obviously, because, you know, here you are 51 years later, and, you know, obviously it was a good choice. But
there is a tragic end to some of the story, however. Diana and Lawton tried, but they couldn't have kids. Mm-hmm. So they adopted a boy and a girl. And right after they adopted the boy, she got pregnant. This was in 1978 or 79. Mm-hmm. They'd been married, you know, for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And finally she got pregnant, and she had a daughter. But about 2 or 3 weeks after coming home, she started to bleed. And they took her back to the hospital, and they couldn't stop the bleeding. They kept giving her transfusion after transfusion after transfusion. Then her organs started to break down. And I think it was December 31st, 1978, she died. And she was only 30-something. It was terrible. I mean, it was the worst Christmas we ever had as a family. And so you just have to wonder about things, I guess.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is that I admire the way you've always managed to deal with adversity. I know that, many things have happened, whether health-related or all kinds of things have happened in your own family and your own experience and are still happening. And having read a draft of the first part, at least, of your memoir, I know that you've had significant battles with depression yourself. Yeah. So can you talk about how you were able to roll with all those punches despite the many crises that you have experienced and having that background of sometimes being depressed?
Yeah, well, it's what Winston Churchill called his black dogs. Mm-hmm. He experienced depression throughout his life.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't even know what causes it. But the thing that I am almost never experience it now. But for the longest time, I think it had to do with I felt a tension between wanting to write and publish or do art and make paintings and drawings, and I couldn't. I was so involved with having so many kids, and I was involved in the work I was doing, and it just never seemed to work out. And then for some reason, sometimes I just get into a deep depression. I don't know why.
Well,
but I was going to church all this time, and most of the time anyway. But the thing that really has supported me and able to deal with things now has been what the Franciscans are by rule are supposed to do, and that is called a daily office. That every morning, say morning prayer in the prayer book, and other prayers. It's part of what we call a rule of life, which involves going to Eucharist, going to retreats, reading and studying, a lot of prayer, and that has been so sustaining. It's been wonderful, and that's what keeps me going.
Yeah.
In all the different troubles.
Yeah.
And I've had spiritual direction, which is really a wonderful thing for people to do, to have a spiritual director to help guide them through problems and giving them advice and good counsel, and I've had an excellent one. So I think that's what the base of it is. Yeah.
And I suppose, my idea about, when people say, why does God allow this or that to happen, or, this sort of thing of people who turn away because things happen that they think are just so awful and should not happen, is, I suppose, the idea of us not being in paradise at the moment. And so the idea is that you have somewhere to turn to cope as you go through life in a situation that is not going to be perfect. I suppose there's these philosophies that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. So, and there are times when I suppose one might wish that God didn't have quite as much faith in you as he seems to. But anyway, you've always inspired me with, sort of at least the outward way that you handle these things. And of course, if Jesus wept, then we're allowed to mourn things as well. So, that's okay too. So anyway, I think this is a good time for you to read The Garden of My Soul.
Oh, okay, sure. This is a very short poem that I wrote. It just came to me. I don't know why. The words just flowed. I wrote this March 30th, 2009. The Garden of My Soul. Flowers bloom in my soul's lush garden. Sweet fragrances of love. Mystical union with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Lilies clothed in raiment more splendid than Solomon in all his glory. Flowers of grace abounding. Luxurious blooms of joy.
Yeah. And that, as you say, 2009, is that right? And
yes.
So that's a time that you've already obviously experienced a lot of things, so there was no rose-colored glasses about the things that can happen in life. So I found that particularly inspiring. So we're going to round things up soon. So the first question that I ask everybody is, what comes to mind when you think of the word beauty?
Well, I'd like to go back to the John Keats quote.
Mm-hmm.
A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Beauty is a joy. I mean, not just, there's all sorts of levels of beauty. You know, the typical beauty of a sunset or the sun glinting off the waters of a lake or the seashore, or it might be the beauty of a person. I mean, not necessarily their outward look, but their inward beauty, the beauty of their soul. And, of course, the beauty of music, because music can always send me into raptures, depending on what it is. But, I mean, I often like to write poetry listening to certain pieces of music.
Any favorites?
Because, I really like listening to, let's see, just got right out of my head. You'd think I'd remember it.
Well, I know your tastes are pretty eclectic, because I know you were talking about a recent recording of old, were they blues or just kind of, that sort of thing. And you already mentioned Miles Davis, but you were a big opera fan as well, a lover of opera?
I love Puccini's Bohème especially. And the aria O mia bambina cara. That's one of his operas.
Yeah, Jenny Schicchi.
And I love some of the Impressionists too. Debussy, Eric Satie, especially his gymnopedes, and it's very simple and not complicated, but it just attracts me very much. Just a wide range of things. I was listening to Wagner yesterday, Parsifal. There are lots of different ones.
And so that gets you in a particular mood, like you say, I just saw a beautiful scene in nature, and I think I want to write a poem, and then you put on whichever composer seems to stimulate that, or do you say, I really feel like I want to write a poem, and then you put on some music and see what comes to mind?
A little of both, I think. Sometimes both. But there's just, music has always been a part of my life, all kinds of music. I mean, I like bluegrass, and I even like Cajun music.
Zydeco, yeah.
I have some Cajun discs and so forth. But I like sacred music too. I like some of the Gregorian chant.
Oh, sure, yeah. Very soothing.
Yes.
There's something very. Well, I think I don't know if they did studies about it, but I know for a while it was very, very popular as something that can create this sense of inner peace just by listening to it, and I understand that. I very much understand that. And
of course, typical Mozart and the classics. That's the other thing too. So I just like all kinds of music, really. Yeah.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, there's so many different emotions, and there's so many different ways, I think, to convey those emotions that, my tastes are very eclectic, too, so I understand that very well. Okay, and my last question, well, I have one more after that, but the second one that I ask everybody is, can art change the world?
I think it can. I think art can be very inspiring, and it can affect people. I think I was thinking of during the Spanish Civil War, the atrocity that occurred in that, and the painting, what was it called, Guernica?
Yeah,
something like that. That people were horrified when they saw what had happened. I mean, it wasn't the age of television yet, so but it showed this terrible atrocity as a painting, and it could change people's attitudes. But I think art can change the world. I also, considering photography also as an art form.
Yeah, definitely.
I was very blessed when I was an art student in Philadelphia that our professor took us to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City to see an exhibit, a photographic exhibit called The Family of Man, which has never been replicated. It was photographs from all around the world, which showed the interrelationship of all people, the humanity of all people. We got to go through the exhibit before it was open to the public, and the photographer who organized this, Edward Steichen, gave us a seminar about it. It's now a coffee table book. You can get it on Amazon.
Oh, wow.
The photographs are absolutely incredible because, the foreword was written by a poet, Carl Sandburg, and for every section there were quotes from different religions or different philosophers or poets that went with it. They were all black and white photographs, but it covered everything from war to childbirth to love. It's just, the photographs are absolutely inspiring, just amazing.
So tell me what it was called again, The Humanity of Man? What was it called?
It's called The Family of Man.
The Family of Man. Okay, I'm going to look that up.
It's on Amazon. You can get it in soft cover as well. And it's just amazing. Just amazing. I've never forgotten that art can change people's lives.
And I love the idea of, obviously we wouldn't be called just man now. I can tell it's no book, but the idea of just drawing all those parallels between humans all over the globe. That's, something that's very timely. And I guess never goes out of style. But so I had to read some poems because your daughter, as a Christmas gift, put together a book of your poems, which if someone was interested in reading more of your poems, they could get. And what is the name of the book?
It's called Points of Fire, Selected Poems of Gary W. Davis.
And is it available? How would it be available if someone wanted to get it?
They could contact me.
Okay.
And I can always have more printed up also.
Okay.
I have copies.
Okay. Well, that's excellent. So, would they email you, or would they how would they
email me? They could call me on the phone, or you could send me a letter.
Yeah. And okay. So your email address? Are you willing to give out your email address? Because
sure.
Okay. What is it?
It's Franciscan Gary. Everything's lowercase. Franciscan Gary at gmail.com.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Gary, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your life and your poetry. And I do hope that you finish your memoirs because they're very, very interesting. So thank you for
it's a love-hate relationship.
Well, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of years. Because how old are you now, if you don't mind?
81.
81. Yeah. So that's a lot to condense into a book. But it's, as I said, it's very interesting, and I find it very inspiring, and I find you very inspiring. So thank you so much for talking to me on Finding Beauty. I'm Maria Thompson Corley.
Okay. Thank you.